Okay, welcome back. This is part 2 of Post-Impressionism. We talked about Van Gogh and Seurat, and in this part we're going to talk about Gauguin, ToulouseLautrec, and Cezanne. We're going to start with this painting by Gauguin, and I had told you in the last part that he spent some time with Van Gogh down in Arles and gave Van Gogh some ideas. And this painting is kind of the jumping off point for Gauguin. Before he made the Vision After the Sermon, he was kind of dabbling in Impressionism. But then he went to Brittany in northwestern France and he experienced the sauvage, which is savage, for the first time. And this was like this wildness and primitiveness of people that couldn't be found in a place like Paris, with all of its cultured and sophisticated, but ultimately to Gauguin, boring people. So when I say sauvage, I mean he considered these people primitive and thus inferior, but also superior in their innocence and naivete. The wildness inspired him to not only paint, but to find a new visual language. During his 2 years in Brittany, he did create a new style. This style emerged. He turned his back on Impressionism, and he discovered the power of clear outlines and large, bold color fields, which is super important, the bold color fields. We'll see that in the painters that followed. His palette became counterintuitive. He was using unlikely colors in place of what somebody would have expected, like reds and yellows for the ground, as opposed to greens and blues. And these colors dominated strange, dreamlike compositions. He was a fan of Japanese prints, just like others, and he would paint these from kind of unexpected angles. This painting depicts a scene from the Bible in which Jacob wrestles an angel. But we're not actually seeing the event. What we're seeing is the women having a vision of the event after a sermon in the church. That red is really stark, and usually you use red as a color to pop out and become a foreground color, but he's using it as a background color, which again is counterintuitive. The use of strong contour lines rather than gradual shifts in tone that most painters practiced also set his style apart. So basically he would just make a line delineating this from that, where other painters would do some shading which would delineate shapes from other shapes. He places a tree trunk diagonally through the center of this painting, which is crazy. And it creates this visual separation between the women of Bretagne, these savages, these sauvage women, and their vision of the angel wrestling with Jacob. And this decision to create the composition in this way develops like a frame for the main subjects of the painting. The branches and the leaves shoot out directly toward the upper right-hand corner of the painting for a second frame around the angel and Jacob. And the perspective of this painting is purposely skewed. Okay, so that's how you do an art historical talk about Gauguin. However, I am loath to even bring him up because he was an abusive pedophile. And this is something that is happening more and more in our culture today, is that great men are being called out for how horrible they are, and then we have to figure out, like, what do we do with this information? And so, of course, that's a great topic for discussion. So that's going to be your discussion topic this week. What do we do about horrible men that make great works of art? There are a few different ways to go. I'm also going to connect you to an article about how to do this if you want to do this kind of scientifically. But I think it's a good topic for discussion because at the beginning, the first person I talked about was Caravaggio, who was a murderer. And there have been other horrible people that we have talked about. Picasso is a misogynist and he treated women poorly. Gauguin is even worse. And he's important in the history of art and like the way his style influenced the people that followed. And if he wasn't, I probably wouldn't bring him up. So let me tell you a little bit about his time in Tahiti, which I had mentioned at the beginning was a new French colony. So while he was there, he took 3 native brides, aged 13, 14, and 14. So he had 3 wives, Tahitian young teenager wives. He infected them and many other local girls with syphilis, which he got from prostitutes in Paris, probably. He sold Tahiti as this sexually liberated erotic wonderland to Parisians. But really, that was just playing upon the colonizers' beliefs about superiority. It was no different than any other Polynesian island, which had Western missionaries and settlers living there for hundreds of years. This painting, Mahana no Atua, painted during his brief return from his travels to Tahiti, depicts this ideal Eden that's closer to his imagination than the colonized cultural reality. You can read all about this story in your book, but just know that he went to Tahiti to find primitive people and experience the world through them. And then he created this fiction where hedonism reigned and the primitives were more pure because of their simple-mindedness. As far as his style, it's similar to that which he had developed in Brittany. There's those large fields of strangely colored ground, and the stylized way that he paints the women directly influenced the fauves like Henri Matisse that we'll talk about later. He created a style and he called it synthetism, and it mixed the observation of a subject with the artist's feelings on that subject. So he is important in art history, and you gotta kind of talk about him, but he does not deserve all the credit that he gets, and he was a horrible person. So again, this will be something that you'll have to figure out how to deal with in your discussion this week. Okay, so we're going to move from Gauguin onto Henri de ToulouseLautrec, and he, instead of leaving and going off and finding primitives in the world, he stayed in Paris, but he did his own kind of anthropological study in the form of prostitutes, again, of Montmartre. He was an aristocratic, he was an alcoholic, he was a dwarf, and this was due to this genetic weakness resulting from his parents who were first cousins when they married. His legs stopped growing after he broke both of them in separate minor incidents during his adolescence. As an adult, he had a normally proportioned upper body but the stubby legs of a dwarf, and I think he was only like 5 feet high, and he walked with real great difficulty. And this, difficulty probably contributed to his alcoholism. You can actually see him here in this painting at the Moulin Rouge. He's in the top center and he's walking next to the tall man in black. I think that's his cousin, the man he's walking with. And you can see the difference in their heights. He's standing, he is the same height as the men who are sitting in front of us. If you remember Van Gogh's paintings and the really thick impasto-like brushstrokes, Lautrec was the opposite. He used what's called peinture à l'essence, or oil thinned with turpentine. And he painted on cardboard, and you can actually see these loose, sketchy brushstrokes, as if the subjects are almost transparent. I mean, this is the antithesis of Van Gogh's just blobby, muck-filled paintings. I mean, I love Van Gogh. I don't mean to disparage it. I'm just saying that this is thinned out paint as opposed to the very thick paint that Van Gogh was using. This painting is noted for its daring composition and dramatic cropping and flat planes of strident color. Again, like Gauguin, you see that big sort of bar that goes down the left side of this painting. There is this giant thing in the foreground that wouldn't have been there had this painting been made 50 years ago. The flaming red-orange hair of the entertainer Jane Avril is the focal point of that group sitting, the seated group in the central part. And we'll look at posters of her in a sec that he made for shows that she was in at the Moulin Rouge, which was a dance hall, basically. But it's the frozen, acid green face of the dancer May Milton that dominates this canvas and kind of haunts the action. Now, you might not have even seen her because she's kind of off to the side, but as soon as you see her, you can't miss her. It's possible that her green face shows the effects of the new stage lights that illuminated this world now, or maybe he was just experimenting with color like Gauguin, we're not really sure. You can also see the influence of Degas in here too, with the strange angles and the cropping or cutting off of a scene as if it's a photograph. I mean, May Milton's shown with only half of her body in this painting. And so it's similar to Degas in the dancer that's kind of cut off on the side. And so ToulouseLautrec was a fan, and he also understood photography and Japanese prints, and these all play a part. ToulouseLautrec eventually died of probably syphilis and alcoholism, which was typical. His career lasted just over a decade, and it coincided with two major developments in late 19th century Paris. The first one was the birth of modern printmaking, and we saw this with Mary Cassatt too earlier. And the second was the explosion of nightlife culture. Now that you had all these gas lamps, people could stay out later, people were going to clubs later. And his posters promoted Montmartre, which was the part of Paris that had all of these clubs and the entertainers as celebrities. And he elevated the popular medium of advertising to the realm of high art. You see these posters and you go, oh, those look more than just a poster for a dance. These are very artful. And they look very similar to his paintings, again, with that sort of thinned out paint and those lines for contours, strange angles. So these posters are not very different from his finished paintings. They were just made into posters to promote these clubs. Okay, we'll end this post-impressionist lecture with Cezanne because he was very influential on what came next. And it is because of the way he approached painting. So he was interested in the simplification of naturally occurring forms and kind of distilling them to their geometric essentials. He wanted to treat nature by the cylinder, the sphere, the cone. For example, a tree trunk may be conceived of as a cylinder, an apple or an orange as a sphere, etc. He also wanted to replace single-point perspective with something new that reflected the ideas of the modern world. He wanted to capture the truth of how people see things, which led him to explore binocular visual properties, or seeing with two eyes graphically. Now, how did he do this? Well, he rendered these paintings slightly different, yet he used simultaneous visual representations of the same subject to provide the viewer with a strange aesthetic of different depths. This is just a fancy way of saying that he used multiple perspectives in the same image. This, instead of confusing the viewer, however, engages them in this ever-shifting dynamic image that's difficult to look away from. His explorations of geometric simplification and optical phenomena inspired the Cubists, Picasso and others, to experiment with ever more complex views of the same subject and eventually the fracturing of form itself. Picasso referred to Cezanne as the father of us all and claimed him as my one and only master. So Cezanne's importance cannot be overstated. He basically is the guy that destroyed perspective and emphasized the flatness of the canvas more than any other artist before. I'm putting this here because I want you to see how far we have come from that Dutch golden age of the 1600s to Cezanne's still life. And you might not think it's that far, but I mean, if you look at the table of Cezanne, it looks all askew and there are weird angles that we're looking at. And just look at the paint style itself. One looks almost cartoonish, Cezanne's, while the other looks like a photograph. And so there are many reasons that they look this way. And even, what they represent. In the Dutch thing, we talked about Calvinism and predestination. And with Cezanne, we're talking about the science of optics. So there are a ton of reasons why these are different, but it's fascinating to see how far we've come in about 250 years. Finally, Cezanne was obsessed with this mountain. It's called Mont Sainte-Victoire. It's in the south of France. And he painted it a whole bunch of times, and he painted it from different angles. This one he paints a deep panoramic scene, but we're aware of the painting as a fairly rough worked surface. Flatness coexists with depth. It's kind of like when Van Gogh would, bring all of the paint to the foreground and made it all kind of flat, but also there was this dynamic spatial thing happening. And it's here as well. The flatness coexists with depth, and we find ourselves caught between these two poles. Now we're more aware of one, like the flatness of the surface. Now the other, like how far back it goes. The mountainous landscape is both within our reach, but still far away. His brushstrokes are varied, and in some cases you can see well-worked and defined bits, and in others there's just kind of a suggestion of a tree or a house. And I think it's fascinating that he incorporates little bits of red here and there that gently bring you to the mountain if you start at the bottom of the painting and follow the red bits up. Here's Mont Sainte-Victoire 7 years later, or maybe even eight or 9 years later. And many of the paintings in this series feature an interesting use of geometric forms to depict the organic landscape. In other words, he's doing what I said, which is he's finding shapes and then painting them like spheres or cylinders or cubes. Particularly, he does this in his later paintings. And the emphasis on these geometric forms paves the way for Cubism, which we will talk about very soon. Okay, that's the end of this lecture. Thanks for listening.